welcome to everybody for being here. Let me post this once again. Posting the link to the brief bio that was prepared for this that gives a good summary, hopefully a faithful summary of Marie-Jeanne's life and some nice photos in there. So please take a look at that. She's going to be touching on some of the highlights. And 83 years boiled down to 30 minutes doesn't quite do it all justice, but we'll do the best we can and really touch on some highlights. You were born, and also let me just say happy birthday to you, Marie-Jeanne. It was a few days ago. I forgot what you said. When was your birthday?
December 12th.
Oh, December 12th. Okay, so a little bit in the past, but close enough that we still can say happy birthday to you for your 83rd. And thank you. Not only is this honoring you and the other elders, you're honoring us by kind of sharing what I think is really valuable information about your life and the world around you as you spent these 83 years. So you were born, if we do the math, of course, you were born in 1937, actually maybe 36 if you were in December, which was an auspicious time considering the place you were born in. And maybe you can tell us, just to start out with, where were you born, and then how did that ripple across the first, let's say, 10 years of your life? How did you lead your life for those first 10 years?
Where I was born is the simple part. That was in Paris in 36, right at the Pont Mirabeau, which is right in the heart of Paris, not far from the Eiffel Tower. I could take you to the clinic, but I'm not going to, unfortunately. In terms of from then to the next 10 years, my goodness, I don't know how to do that.
Well, tell us about what happened, as war was beginning to rumble. What happened to your family and to you personally?
Well, as the Germans began to really push and look as though they were going to do something, God knew what, we began as a family to make preparations. My uncle and aunt and their kids, my cousins, went to my aunt's farm in just outside of Troyes in middle of France. And my mother took my brother and I off to the east, which doesn't make much sense, but it was the safest at that point, toward Alsace. And my father went to England to join de Gaulle's army. And he used that as a base from then on. And my mother and brother and I first went to Donne-Marie-en-Montois, which is just outside of Paris. And then we began, as the Germans approached, to start south. And we drove as far as we could until the car wouldn't go. Then we hopped onto a hay wagon or something like, I'm not quite sure. This is nearly all of this stuff that I've been told. I don't have personal memory. So we went south and finally ended up in Marseille on the ocean, and my mother was able to get a boat from there to the States. My brother and I were left in Grenoble, or outside of it, in the mountains above in the Alps, tucked into a farm there. And he and I spent several years with them. Can't tell you too much because I don't have memory.
You don't have any memory of what that was like, living without your parents, living with your brother, living with another family? You said it was close to Lyon, near Grenoble?
Yes, it's in the Alps above Grenoble.
But not a lot of memory of that. You were maybe 5 or 6 at the time?
A little less.
Okay.
And what I remember is mostly emotional
Yeah.
and a little real, if you will.
Tell us about that.
That's tough, Jeff. It's the sense of being alone and unable to care for oneself. The why a child, an infant, should do that is a good question. My brother was my support. I was his. He was 2 years older than I. And we spent the rest of our lives sort of having moments of, do you remember this? Do you remember that? Do you think it really happened? Do you think it didn't happen?
Mm-hmm.
Very hard to hang on to.
So eventually, after those several years living in that with that family and the farm, you and your brother and most of the rest of your family were able to leave Europe and made your way to the United States, correct?
Almost, just the rest of the family didn't make it.
Okay.
They didn't try. My brother and I and my father, and we all rejoined my mother in LA and then moved to, guess where? Washington, D.C. 3400 Rodman Street. I can drive by it and I see it and I have all these memories.
Really? So that was your first stop in the United States, Washington, D.C.
It was. Prior to that, we had stopped in Canada, just outside of Montreal in Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
that whole area. We wandered around and then we stayed in Saint-Adèle. Obviously, French was the tie there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also another man who had been in the army with my father. Very unusual. There were very few Jews in the army. They weren't accepted. And in terms of managing to go ahead, to get ahead in the army, it was very difficult. But this guy was a colonel in the French army, in the French Air Force, sorry. And he had moved to Saint-Adèle after the war, immediately after the war. And my father, who was a lieutenant colonel, then colonel, I hope I got that right. I usually screw it up. He found that Claude was there, and my mother, brother, and I, and he all went up there and stayed with Claude and then stayed in the village itself.
So can you tell us, you mentioned your parents, can you say just a little bit about both of them and kind of how they found each other? And, you know, I think that their story has something to do with the reason that you ended up in the United States later, right? Maybe start with your mother.
That's a good idea. Yes, is the answer to that sort of question. So my parents met actually when they were both at the Beaux-Arts in Paris. My father was studying to become an architect. My mother was studying to become a sculptress, which she did and he did. And they did very well at the Beaux-Arts. And now I've lost my way, sorry.
Your father and your mother, where they met at the Beaux-Arts, and
right,
tell us about.
Right, my mother had come to France when she was 1.5 years old because my grandfather had died and my grandmother needed some assistance. Now, when he died of flu. And I don't know that it's been hanging around all this time, but it certainly feels that way. And then, so my grandmother came to Paris, which is where one of her sisters was living at the time. And they stayed in Paris and did all kinds of things to keep body and soul together, though they were, that really isn't too accurate because they kept saying body and soul together when you would talk with them. But the truth of the matter was that they were pretty well off and didn't need, the body and soul didn't make sense. Um, they did all kinds of things, including stuff that they just did because they felt like it, which is at one point they were models for hats for, gosh, I think it was Macy's. I don't recall now. It'll come back to me. When it does, I will tell each one of you individually.
In France?
This was in Paris. And my mother would tell stories of coming home and finding her mother in the bathtub with a hat on her head and her hair perfectly coiffed. She wouldn't take the hat off because it would ruin her hair. So she stayed in the tub that way. My great aunt did the same sort of thing. I come from a long line of really extraordinary women.
And speaking of which, so your mother, as you said, was born in the United States, moved to France as a very young child, and then moved back to the United States, I think you told me. And then shortly before, I guess certainly before you were born, but mid-30s, moved back to France. That's where she met your father. And isn't that the story that you told me? I think is that the chronology?
Not quite, but it's close enough.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Actually, Mom went to France, as I said before, when she was a year and a half. And we did some trips back to the States when my brother and I were born. And later on, as I said, the family was pretty well off, really, that they would be able to travel back to the United States constantly to see her family is pretty extraordinary at the time. Anyway, they then stayed in Paris until the Germans came along.
Right. And your father, I think you said, was a liaison during the war between de Gaulle and Eisenhower, which you said was not an easy job for him.
Exactly. De Gaulle was pretty anti-Semitic in his attitudes. I don't know if one could pin that on to him otherwise, but I do.
And so your mother, because she's an American citizen, you were able to make it back to the United States with a visa from her. Your family was able to go. You ended up making your way to California, to Los Angeles area, which is where you went to school, you went to college. You initially went to school, got a fine arts degree. You were an artist, a painter. You practiced as a painter for a few years, and then you got a PhD in comparative literature. I'm just kind of speeding over these things really quickly. I realize there's a lot to say there. You taught for about a dozen years as a literature professor, and then made another turn in your career. Can you tell us about that? Because this is also leading to your relationship with Rabbi Sandy.
Well, I made a turn. I don't know how unusual that is actually, because in many ways, painting to literature to going to HUC, Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, to do a master's in Jewish communal service. They all sort of lead one into the other, with the idea that you are exploring a lot of your own creativity at the same time, which is what happened for me. I went to HUC and met there other people who thought that I should meet Sandy, and I couldn't see any point. I was involved in another relationship that was really floundering, but that had nothing to do with anything. I just couldn't see any reason. And we met, and I said, okay, she's got curly hair, okay. And then we said goodbye to one another, and that was going to be it. When it wasn't, we continued a friendship. And then it turned into more than a friendship, and that was 37 years ago, as I said.
37 years. And you were colleagues, I think you told me, in the
We were,
same social service agency.
right, for Jewish Family Service. Our offices were across the hallway from one another. And at one point I was in the middle of losing the other relationship I had been in and recognizing that I had something that was beginning to feel interesting with Sandy. But I would go into her office either furious and saying, "You can't believe what she did to me this time," or "I can't believe what she did to me this time," or what have you. Anyway, that was the end of that. And Sandy and I became friends, and then we became more than friends, and then we became.
And for 37 years, congratulations on that. Can you tell us about what your social work practice was? You're a clinical social worker for most of that episode of your career, right? And can you tell us a little bit more about what you did, what the kinds of work that you did in that?
Sure. Simple question. I basically, as you say, was a clinician. I opened a clinic in Watts under the auspices of LA Child Guidance, which actually was an offspring of the Child Guidance Clinic in Philadelphia, which we'll come back to in a minute. But I also worked for Jewish Big Brothers and for the American Jewish Committee.
And private practice too.
And had a private practice wherein I specialized a lot in working with child survivors of the Holocaust. Excuse me.
So, keep going, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I don't know where I was, to tell you the truth.
You were talking about your practice. The last thing you said was that you worked with child survivors of the Holocaust. Can I just dig in on that a little bit?
Sure.
So you had your own experience, obviously, in Europe as a Jew fleeing Europe, being hidden. I take it that wasn't a coincidence that became part of your practice. What did you draw from that personally, doing that kind of work?
That was very healing for me in many ways, actually. Child survivors were a strange breed. I mean, there are a couple of us in the congregation, and you probably will note that we are odd in our own ways. Is there a problem, Claude? Keep going. Anyway, working with people who had gone through this as kids, many of us don't have any memory. Many of us don't have anything that we can hang our hats on that create a stable structure for which we can then rely and be able to live our lives comfortably. It was also at a period when people were just beginning to recognize child survivors. And in the early 80s, I was asked to assist in building a community, if you will, or at least to have some place where people could turn, both individually and in terms of learning about themselves, which was the Child Survivor Network. We formed a group in LA, and among other things, this was the first meeting of this sort of group. There were a number of people who were interested in what was happening with us emotionally. One of the things that occurs to me at this point is that I was just thinking about one of the stories that I often would tell about the power of the group, which deals with, we would break up into groups of child survivors talking to one another, partners of child survivors talking to one another, and then come back together again and discuss what had happened in the groups. And you would hear all kinds of unbelievable stories, such as the one I'm thinking of. I was listening to the group that was behind me, and there was a group on my side that was also finishing at about the same time. And they were saying things like, the group behind me, one of the women was saying that she had been I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. She had been essentially on the train to Auschwitz and didn't know, I mean, she had lost her parents by then, and she didn't know where they were. That's what I mean by lost. Then to the left of me, this other group, there was someone who was saying that they had been on a train to a camp, couldn't remember where, and that he had lost his sister and his parents and didn't know what had happened to them at that time. Found out later. And then you put it together, and these two were the siblings who had not known each other.
Huh. And speaking of siblings, you mentioned earlier that your brother, who was 2 years older than you, that you and he spent time, later in life trying to piece together memories and go back and find out. And by the way, somebody asked, had you maintained any kind of a relationship with that family that hid you in near Lyon? And I believe you told me you did not, right? You don't have.
Correct. Yeah.
With them. Okay, but were you able to piece some of those memories over the years together with the help of your brother and other people you encountered?
Not really. My brother's memory was not much more reliable than mine. And we just didn't have the information. He and my mother did not get along. I suspect some of it was because she left. I don't know.
Okay. And you mentioned that he passed away a few months ago, is that right?
That's correct.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you also tell us, Leila Galberner said she's known you for like 45 years. And she said there's a story about being a beggar in Japan. That's an interesting introduction there.
That's a fascinating introduction. That's fine. I went to Japan to study, actually. And one of the ways that one studied was to, well, I don't need to go into that. One of the arenas that I was interested in was Zen, and how that could translate. I was painting at the time, how that could translate into painting. And I was studying with Alan Watts and a few other people like him. Very fortunate for me. And among the other things that we did, I stayed in a monastery, and as a Zen monk, you would go out in the morning with your bowl, and you would go door to door saying nothing, just holding the bowl, and you would get what you would get, and then you would eat that, and that was it, kid. One way or another. It worked pretty well. I never lost enough weight.
Do you still draw on any of those Zen practices that you learned at that time?
In terms of meditation, yes.
You're a regular practitioner of meditation?
I'm an irregular practitioner at this point. I'm irregular everything at this point.
Okay. Can you, now, just again, to fast forward the story a little bit, you and your wife, Rabbi Sandy Rubenstein, moved to Philadelphia. I don't know the exact year, but she was not rabbi at the time, but she became rabbi at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. That's why you moved to Philadelphia. You practiced there for a while, clinical social work. And then in 2009, I believe because Sandy was taking a job here in the DC area, you both moved to the Washington DC area. And that was the moment that you said, that's when you retired in 2009. Is that the right chronology?
Sort of, yes. That is when I retired.
And you said to me that you found retirement to be wonderful. You were actually quite vivid about how you've had a good retirement. You've enjoyed yourself. Tell us about that.
Not much to tell. I don't have to do a damn thing.
So that's what's wonderful about it, I guess.
What's wonderful about it is being able to really do what you like and have the time to think.
Mm-hmm. And have you been able to get back to things like painting, for example? Has that been a lifelong practice as well, since you were trained as a painter?
No, as a matter of fact. And I'm actually not doing any painting now.
Mm-hmm. Sandy, is there any piece of the story that you think about Marie-Jeanne that you think we would all like to know that should be illuminated here?
Yes, I think that in our time in Los Angeles, one of the places that was so very important to us was Beit Chaim Chadashim, and the gay and lesbian synagogue there that Marie-Jeanne and I were both very involved in, but Marie-Jeanne played a pivotal leadership role at a very challenging time. And maybe you want to say more? Was president there. We have several of our members on this screen with us today. We are very pleased. We have a very, and there are several members here of Adat Shalom, actually. I think there are like 6 or 8 of us who are connected in some way. But I would say community and belonging and being a part is very important to her and to us.
And when you say it was a challenging time, what was going on that made that role challenging?
You get to answer that.
I get to answer
I guess
that.
there's a story there, huh?
Which story are you thinking of? The one about the president?
I just know it was a challenging time. You can answer it any way you want.
We had a president at the time. I was on the board. And the president was more, actually, he was very Trump-like, if I think about it. I think that'll suffice as a comment.
Okay. Yeah. But also, what are we talking, this is the early 80s, maybe? Mid 80s?
No, 90s, actually.
90s.
Late
Okay.
80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
So at the time that, gay and lesbian synagogues were not a new thing, but still a work in progress, still building momentum. Was that a challenge at the time within the community to step out as a clearly identified gay and lesbian community? What was that experience like?
Well, Bet Haim Hadashim, which is the temple we're talking about, essentially began because of the Christian clergy that was interested in helping gays and lesbians feel comfortable with their whole selves. And because of that, I'm trying to think of his name and it just went away again.
Troy Perry.
Troy Perry. Thank you, Mike.
Reverend Troy Perry, yeah.
Fortunately, I have my memory to my left. And he enabled us to come together and have space in which to worship, and then eventually helped us create the shul that we eventually became. It was at the same time that CBST in New York was building. And both sides of the states sort of came out at once. And it was, we didn't have trouble with coming out, more trouble healing people who had had difficulty with their families of origin. And we were dealing with the AIDS crisis at the same time.
Right.
And as women, we were spending our lives visiting the men and doing the best we could for them. And as men, they were doing the best they could to survive. And many didn't. It was a very difficult time.
You know, Jeff, an interesting story, if we have time, is one Marie-Jeanne has told about a time down at a bar in LA, and what that meant as a lesbian, to be able, you know, and her coming out story, I think, is just sort of interesting in that way. Sell that one.
You want to talk about that?
My theory is if somebody brings up a story like that, they should tell it.
But you tell it so well.
I think she's telling you something, Sandy.
You think she's telling me to tell it?
No,
Anyway, I truly don't recall what she was.
And this is the one around the 3 pieces of clothing. 3 pieces of clothing.
Oh, I know what she's now talking about. As women in the late 80s, early 90s, as gay lesbian women,
Earlier,
and earlier,
or much earlier.
probably in the 70s, actually, I've been thinking about it.
Yeah.
Among other things, to try and give you a glimpse of what it was like, when you went out on the weekend in hopes of meeting people, you had to make it sure of what you were wearing. In LA, there was a law that said, mind you, that said that essentially you could not go out wearing clothing that didn't belong to your sex. So they had a law that said 3 pieces of clothing for women. You had to have 3 pieces of clothing that were female. Without that, you were thrown in jail.
was it enforced?
Yes.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Pretty shocking.
Now.
Yeah, now I guess, right, but different time.
Well,
Let me ask you also, you mentioned to me when we spoke before that you've been struggling with your own health challenges in the last several years. Can you tell us, you know, what do you do to kind of steel yourself to struggle with those challenges? You've been quite valiant about it, as most of us have observed. How do you
say that, but we think that?
Yeah, I think everybody else who's observed would say that about you, Marie-Jeanne. Tell us, where does that resilience come from?
I have no idea.
And of course, we hope you're doing well now, as well as you can.
Well, that all depends on how you define well. But in any case, I think actually that resilience, as you put it, comes primarily from just putting one foot in front of the other and not focusing on woe is me.
Okay. Before we're coming, maybe even a little over where we had expected, but we have a couple minutes. Before I ask my last question, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to talk about?
Nothing I can think of.
Okay. Sandy, anything to add?
No, just my heart is very full.
Good. That's great. Well, the question that I wanted to ask you, and I said it's something I'd like to ask the others I'm interviewing as well, is what do you know now at this young age that you wish you had known when you were much younger, and what would you have done with that knowledge?
I think what I've learned in all of this is that nothing is that important, or very little. That you don't need to worry about where your next meal is coming from, where you're going to put your head down, or anything else of that ilk. It happens. It'll happen for you. It may be on the street. It may be on the concrete. It may be stuff you don't want to eat, but it's there. And you are fed and you are nourished. And that having that same nourishment for the mind and for the spirit is really what is important.
That's really lovely. Thank you very much. With that, again, thank you for being here to do this and for honoring us with all this really wonderful information with, the story of your life. It's beautiful. Thank you.